For fellow art rebels who want to imagine new worlds, Revolution Art Society is a monthly newsletter and podcast that dives deep into the ideas, experiences, and people inhabiting the cracks in the establishment. Join artist and mother Maya Mackrandilal as she explores enticing new ways of looking at the world and engages in conversations with creators of all kinds. Welcome. Taking a nice deep breath. I want to express my gratitude for your time, your attention, your presence. I want to open up a space for us to step back from our everyday concerns and reflect on our larger purpose. I believe that everyone is an artist, even if you don't yet claim that label. Just as nature is endlessly abundant and creative, each person on this planet is an embodiment of that creativity, and this podcast is a place to connect to the deeper meaning of that creative drive. A little about me. I'm an artist and a writer, an educator, an administrator, a small business owner. I am a mother. As an artist, I've been working in various aspects of the art world and the culture sector, starting, like most of us from when I was very young, but in terms of taking my art as a quote-unquote career, that started when I was in undergrad. So it's been almost 20 years at this point of navigating these spaces. I'm also a writer. Fiction, poetry, prose, critical essays. That's really what I've been focusing on quite a more recently is the critical essays, but still writing in other ways as well. In terms of being an educator, I've worked with youth, primarily high school, college-aged youth, but just really interested in sharing knowledge. And that's part of the motivation for creating this podcast, is a way to reconnect to that piece of myself that is an educator. Over the past few years, I have been working more in education arts administration, though there has been definitely an educator aspect to my work. I really want to kind of dive down into ideas more, which is what really excites me about being an educator, is diving into ideas, listening to what other people are interested in, their reactions. So this is definitely intended to be a conversation in many ways. I really want to invite feedback from my listeners, questions, topics that you're interested in me exploring. And then we'll also occasionally have guests that I'll be in actual conversation with or in a different type of conversation with. So definitely education is a part of what I bring to this. And then as a small business owner, I did start Revolution Dressed, which is an apparel brand where I translate my art into things that you can wear. So t-shirts, tote bags, fun stuff like that. So definitely check out the Etsy shop if you haven't done that yet. And then finally, this last label, Mother, last identity that I bring here. And this is a newer label for me. My son is a little over a year and a half old. But it has been a big transformation in my life and has really brought a lot of things to the foreground, which is part of why I'm really motivated to create this podcast now, is that a lot of knowledge, a lot of downloads have been coming. And I just think it's really important that I don't keep them all bottled up inside, that I get them out into the world, and hopefully, what's been coming through will be interesting to you. I was a little concerned about foregrounding this mother identity, this identity as a parent. I was worried that people would hear it, and because they maybe don't identify with that label, aren't planning to identify with that label, that they'll think that this is somehow not for them. And I hope that you'll stay with me, stay engaged, and you'll see that, like every other aspect of life, what happens in the space of childcare, of bringing a person into the world, of guiding them through the world. These are things that are ripe for art, for critique, for deep thought. And I think that everyone needs to be engaged in that for a lot of different reasons. So that's part of what the podcast is going to be exploring is, our connection to these issues, regardless of whether or not we are biological parents or, take care of or caregiver or direct caregivers, because we're all caregivers in some ways for each other. So another aspect of myself that I bring to this podcast is my family history. So I just want to share, kind of brief overview, and I think this will come out in different ways over the course of the podcast, depending on who's here talking to me. But, I am a mixed race woman of color, depending on your definitions, first generation American, child of immigrants. My mother is from Guyana, which is in South America, but culturally part of the Caribbean. It is an English-speaking country, was a British colony. My ancestry is Indo-Caribbean. So Indo-Caribbean means that my ancestors were indentured laborers from India and China, as well as enslaved West Africans. So really an identity that is a mix of a lot of different cultures and traditions coming together to create this really beautiful culture of survival in conversation with the land. So, of course, in conversation with the indigenous people who lent and continue to lend many practices and wisdoms to our community. And then there was an additional sort of shift. There was the shift from these continents, very far away. And then there's the additional shift of my mother's generation, where a lot of people from Guyana emigrated to North America. So in my family, that meant the United States primarily. So my mother and her sisters and brothers immigrated to the United States. And so that created a separate kind of, I think of them as fractures, and having to heal those fractures or make sense of them or reweave them into our lives. So I grew up in a home where my mother was a single parent, and I had various aunts and uncles, some, from my maternal side, some by marriage, so they were from additional cultures. So I grew up in this very multicultural family with a variety of influences and worldviews, and that has really shaped how I look at the world. I think there's a little bit of that outsider view that even though, I am an American, I did not see myself and my experience reflected in the dominant culture growing up. And so that creates a specific type of person, a specific type of way of being in the world. And so I definitely bring that to the podcast. In terms of my interests in art and writing and creativity in general, very much influenced by what I just talked about. So I explore history, I explore personal narratives as well as collective narratives, very interested in troubling, sort of dominant historical narratives, in particular, looking at Western art history and its reliance on white supremacy and trying to trouble that narrative, expose the cracks and the I don't want to say inaccuracies, but because, all histories are a type of story, right? And so they're accurate to the people telling them, but there are other people and other stories that I think are important that I try to bring to the foreground. So with that comes explorations of identity, migration, race, gender, and power. Recently, I've also gotten curious about posthumanism and shifting my perspective to that of other living beings like trees, rhizomes, and fungi. So really looking forward to sharing some of those thoughts with you as well. So what is this podcast? The best way I can describe it is an invitation to wander with me, to go on a journey where the destination isn't clear, may never be clear. A journey that I have been on that is ongoing. I can't point to a place and a time when it started. I think that there are many beginnings. So even though the journey doesn't have a destination, it doesn't mean that it doesn't have deep intention. So this intention of getting present, of going deep, of really thinking about, what is it that we're doing in this world, of imagining how we can do things differently, create different futures, generate a sense of hope in a time of a lot of darkness. So there is deep intention here, even if we are wandering. And so in thinking about this metaphor of wandering and realizing in a lot of ways in my life, it's also not a metaphor, it's very literal. I remembered one of my ancestors. My mother referred to him as a wandering sadhu, a wandering holy man. But how we're going to get to him is actually through the story of another ancestor that I want to share with you. So this is my grandmother's maternal grandmother. Her name was Ramsuki. And so she was a little girl living in India, not sure exactly where. There are theories, but we'll just leave it as India. And she was maybe 10, 11, 12 years old, going to the well in her village. She gets some water, and she was kidnapped by marauders. Some of you might recognize this connection to some of my work. I'm really interested in this bandit queen named Pulan Devi, who has a similar story of being kidnapped. But Ramsuki, does not take the Pulan Devi route and become a marauder, a thuggy herself. She is sold by, I'm not sure if it was the marauders directly, the bandits, or if, through a series of people. But eventually she is sold into indenture, into the British indenture system. So she ends up on a boat traveling to the other side of the planet. And while she's on this boat, the women realize that, she is quite young, that she has been kidnapped, that there's no one really to take care of her. And they decide, I guess, they were doing the best that they could in very difficult circumstances, but they decide that the best thing is to marry her off to a man that is on the boat as well, because they feel like she can't go on this journey by herself unprotected. So this man, again, my mother called him a wandering sadhu. I do want to, add the little commentary that it's a little unusual to have a holy man on a boat at this time, because at this time, Hindus believed that crossing what they called Kalapani, the black water, was ritually unclean. And so you would lose caste if you did this. So, a holy man is, usually a higher caste person. So, it did happen, but usually you would have to go through a lot of ritual cleansing upon your return. And it was definitely not something that people typically did. So, just a little bit of question there, like, how do we know he was a holy man? Um, but we'll just go along with this story that that's who he was. And, so this little girl gets married to this grown man who is supposed to protect her. And so they arrive in Guyana after what, by all accounts, is a quite harrowing journey. All of the ships, by the way, that are taking the indentured laborers to these plantations were the slave ships. They just took out the chains, because now you didn't even need the chains, because the oppression, economic oppression, was the chain that kept you in the boat. So it's a different system, but all the apparatus, were the same. It was the same slave ships. It was the same slave quarters. It was the same plantations, the same overseers. You just different people, different words, different methods of control. So Ramsuki arrives in Guyana and is still indentured. So still has to work off her indenture. Typically, this was 5 to 10 years. And so this means that she's not being paid to work because somebody else has already been paid for her labor and she's paying off that debt. So her husband, Mr. Wandering Sadhu, just sort of hanging around because he's not indentured, but isn't really working either. He impregnates her, so she does have, I believe, 2 children with him. And so she has 2 children with him. And I'm realizing now that I misspoke earlier. This is actually my grandmother's paternal grandmother. So her son is my grandmother's father. So so Ramsuki, has these 2 children, is working on a sugarcane plantation, probably very little food because it's just rations. Again, she's not getting paid money, so, deeply poor. And this guy, not really helping with the kids, not really working, not really doing anything. And my grandmother, her version of the story is that he abandons her eventually. My mother says that she kicked him out. I don't know. I feel like the effects regardless are the same, which is that she was abandoned, so really compounding this trauma. And so this is how he kind of wanders out. And I think he does come back later, much, much later, but not really to take care of her. I think maybe to visit at some point, visit his sons. But he ends up in Suriname and has another family and I don't know, does his thing. But anyways, I have this habit of wanting to cast out the unsavory ancestors. And I find this man deeply unsavory, to abandon this young woman to compound this trauma, of being taken, of losing all community for the rest of her life. She obviously rebuilt community in the new place that she was in, but she lost her family, she lost her history. And then this person who she was told was going to take care of her does not. So, the reality is that trauma is ancestral trauma, and it is passed down from body to body, and it does live in me. And so I see his sins as unforgivable, more so because he just so carelessly, is wielding his power as a man to just do whatever he wants. But, if we believe his story, we accept that he was a holy man and not a grifter, then he was a little bit of an adventurer. He was willing to do things that most people in his position were not willing to do, to go out to a new place and to discover new things. He was on a journey, and in a way, I'm intimately connected to that journey because he is my ancestor. And that searching that he was on is an inheritance that has been passed down to me. My mother, very much of a similar bent. She was very directed for a very long time, was one of the first women to work at the World Bank, one of the first women of color to work at the World Bank. And then when I was 10, she decided that this was not the right path for her and left that job, moved me out to Iowa to be part of this transcendental meditation movement. And, I carry a lot of ambivalence about this choice. I recognize this amazing act of bravery, to leave your life behind in pursuit of something more. But, as a child, kind of caught in the wake of that rupture, especially, I already kind of had some deep anxieties for various reasons. It was hard for me and continues to be hard. So anyways, this is the podcast where past, present, and future are woven together, pulled apart. At its heart, it asks the question, what is art? Which is intimately connected to what is life? And how do we survive living in the cracks of empire? These are questions I've been asking throughout my practice, from my work at the very start of, my more quote unquote serious practice almost 20 years ago to the present. And this search has taken on new levels, new meaning, new urgency as I have become a mother. So I just wanted to give kind of a little example, a little moose-bouche of, some of the things that have really come to the fore for me. Having become a mother, still being an artist, still having this critical bent to the way I approach the world. So the other day, I was out with my husband and my son. We were having what, maybe you can call it dinner. Our son tends to take his nap in the middle of the day. So we have our kind of big meal of the day when he wakes up in the mid-afternoon, which is kind of nice because then you are at restaurants when they aren't super crowded. So we decided to go to this pizza place that we had never been to before in Silver Lake. And, my son, he's a Leo, so very personable, very sweet, in a good mood a lot of the time, but he's also a toddler, so he has, his good days and his, more complicated days. And so this was like a pretty good day for him. I don't think that there was any food on the floor, which was, some kind of miracle. And he was just being cute and having a good time, and we were all having a good time. And there was this man and woman who were at kind of this booth next to us, and they were, smiling at him and waving at him and kind of enjoying him. And he loves, the attention, loves to, shine it all right back at people. And so our meal is done, and my husband and I realized, like, yes, our son is reaching his limit. So my husband took him outside to kind of run around up and down the sidewalk while I waited to pay the check. And the man at the booth next to me says, like, oh, your son is so sweet. What's his name? And I tell him his name. And then he says, I normally hate kids, but he's really great. And, I didn't say anything. I just sort of went silent. Because it was just like such a slap in the face, to just say out loud that you hate an entire class of people, and that I'm supposed to accept this as a compliment. It's just wild. And just to kind of dive into that statement and kind of what sort of unfolds from that. Children are whole human beings. Some days they are super sweet. We joke that our son is propaganda for babies because every time we're out and about, he's such a sweetie. But, that doesn't mean that there aren't struggles, because every human being has emotions and needs and desires that are not always met. And we all deserve to be accepted in our entirety, not just when we are pleasant for other people to be around. And, I'm like, well, what if, my son was disabled? And this man said, I normally hate disabled people, but your son is pretty great, like, and just put in, insert any like category of people, any identity in there, and it becomes deeply offensive. But why is it okay? Like, why is this sort of culturally accepted? Why do we tolerate this speech, that people are so comfortable to even say that to a parent? And I think if we're being really honest, it's because it's true, because this culture hates children. We see it in our practices, in the values of this culture, and how it treats children as objects to be controlled, in how casually adults hurt them, in how deeply our institutions fail them. I think our culture, because of its hyper-individualism, sees any kind of interdependence as dependence. And dependence is probably the greatest sin of this culture, to be dependent on another person. And children need people. They need care. And to need that is taboo. And so our culture cannot help but see children as wrong, as needing to be corrected. And to just kind of dive to sort of the most basic level, since children are a class of people that every person on this planet was once a part of, And really, you're still a part of that class of person because at the very foundation of who you are, how your mind works, that was built when you were a child. That child is still there. And I think we all know, if you've done any kind of therapy, reparenting, self-reflection, that child is still there. And that's normal. But we live in a culture that hates children. So we live in a culture that hates us, that teaches us to hate ourselves. So everyone, not just mothers, parents, caregivers, must be deeply engaged in liberatory thinking around children because it is our own freedom and the freedom of the future of all people that is at stake. So, what if instead we saw children as big, bright warning lights, little alarm bells going off, pointing us to the failures of this culture? Maybe they highlight that this culture, this Euro-American, patriarchal, heteronormative, white supremacist, capitalist culture was built around the needs of traumatized man babies. I was reading this biography of Jung, and there's this throwaway anecdote, just a couple of lines to give context to something else. And the author mentions this practice in certain sectors of European society where, after lunch, the patriarch would retire for a nap, and the entire family, the wife, the children of all ages, would just sit silently at the table to display their obedience to him. And I was just shocked when I read this. It was just like such a complete reversal of what should be going on, like whose needs should be centered. It was just deeply absurd to just picture these people, like these women and children, just sitting silently at a table while this man napped. Like who needs the nap? It's just, I don't know. I can't. I'm here like cracking myself up. But I would argue that this mentality that seems so absurd is actually, it actually permeates our culture. And it lies at the heart of what that man in that restaurant said to me. Um, my son was great because he was pleasant and cute, but would have been deserving of hate if he had had messier, more complicated emotions that day. The compliment in quotation marks, is also a veiled threat because no child is in a good mood all of the time. And so what it says is that, well, when your child isn't in this good mood, then he is deserving of hate, which implies that kind of judgment also on the parent because, why can't we control, our child to always be in this wonderful mood? And how dare we have the audacity to bring them to get pizza or go on a plane or go shopping? To upset the sleeping patriarch that exists in all spaces. And I contend with him daily whenever I take my child anywhere. He's this metaphor that has very real effects on how I feel when I'm in public and what I'm focusing on. And I have to consciously sort of disengage from that kind of silent threat and be okay with my son's more difficult feelings. And that's my work as a parent. But this sleeping patriarch, he also invades my home with his ideas like I shouldn't hold my son when he cries because I'll spoil him with my love, that my son should sleep not based on the needs of his body, the knowledge gained over millions of years of evolution, but he should sleep in such a way to facilitate the 8-hour workday, the factory industrial revolution idea of when we should be awake and when we should be asleep and what we should be doing and what is productive and when. So all this is to say, I've always wanted to change the world, but I've never wanted to burn it all down quite as much as I do now. And I know I'm not the only one who feels that way for a variety of reasons. I think this is just to say, when we remake the world, let's remake it for children.